Thank you so much, Simon, and thank you for having me and the rest of the IPA to Sydney today. I'm going to ask a really stupid question and then I'm going to answer it. Why care about freedom of speech? It's an extraordinary question to ask, you would think, but as Simon and I and our IPA colleagues, and I know Janet and I know her colleagues at The Australian, have been fighting the proposals that Simon was describing just then, the question comes up all the time. Right at the end of, say, a radio interview, you'll end up with, yeah, but freedom of speech isn't that important. Sure, everybody starts that interview by saying, yeah, well, I support freedom of speech, absolutely. But when you drill down to the nitty-gritty, when you start discussing the policy specifics, when you start discussing the Racial Discrimination Act, that facade quickly falls away. You realise what the left mean by freedom of speech is something more like agreeable, uncontroversial, friendly speech, or freedom of speech for them. Or paid for by us, exactly. I know, I said we were doing radio interviews, so you figured it out. For the next 10 minutes, I'm going to answer that question. I'm going to talk about why freedom of speech is our most fundamental liberty, where it came from, and why it is under such sustained threat. Every society in history, whether free or tyrannical, has had an idea about freedom of speech, even if it was just to regret its absence. Both the ancient Athenians and the ancient Romans believed that the defining feature of their civilization was that their citizens were free to speak their mind. The Greek poet Aeschylus wrote that with the defeat of the tyrannical Persians, fear will no more bridle speech. The Roman historian Tacitus believed that a free Roman citizen was defined by how they were allowed to think what they please and say what they think. Unfortunately for Tacitus, this was a high point for freedom of speech. The emperors, he'd just entered the imperial period of ancient Rome, the emperors were much less interested in protecting the liberties of their subjects. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, as I'm sure you all know from secondary school, the question of freedom of speech was subsumed into a general question of religious toleration and persecution. During the Middle Ages, as you all know, to hold a dissenting religious view was to face exile or execution. An even greater crime than to hold that view, though, was to share that view with others, and worse, to try to convince others that your view was correct. This connection between religious toleration and freedom of speech is why I might dwell on Tacitus's point for a moment. He said again, freedom of speech is thinking what you please and saying what you think. The most important part of that quote is thinking what you please. It is our capacity for independent thought that makes us individuals. It is that free thought that leads us to form our own preferences, our own desires, our own views, and our own political opinions. It has been the expressed desire of totalitarian states and theocracies throughout history to suppress those desires and to suppress the opinions of their subjects. So when I talk about freedom of speech, when we talk about freedom of speech, we're really talking about the outgrowth, the outside of a much deeper freedom, the freedom to think independently. After all, freedom of conscience and thoughts, and without the freedom to express those thoughts, would be entirely hollow. And a freedom of thought that would have no substance if your thoughts could not be tested against the thoughts of others. Freedom of speech is also the freedom to hear the speech of your friends, your family, even David Suzuki. I might change that in future speeches. I'm not sure. So when a ruler or a law censors speech, they are abridging the liberties not just of the speaker, but of those who have a natural right to hear their argument. If the government shut down a newspaper, if somebody took Andrew Bolt to court, they're not just shutting down the rights of the speakers. They're not just shutting down the rights of the journalists or Andrew Bolt or anybody like that. They're shutting down our rights to listen. No matter how objectionable, obscene, offensive, or outright wrong any of the arguments we hear might be. The 19th century English economist John Stuart Mill argued this most famously in his great book on liberty. For Mill went further. He said even outright falsehoods should be freely permitted. Because if individuals are protected from controversial views or even wrong facts, they could no longer be considered rational and autonomous intellects. If the government censors speech like that, it would take the responsibility of assessing what is true and untrue, what is wrong and what is offensive, what is correct and what is benevolent. They will take it away from us and give it to legislators. Not only is this a deeply paternalistic idea, but it embeds some disturbing moral beliefs about the intellectual capacity of our fellow humans. Do we think that, in general, people are generally truth-seeking, generally responsible, for whom there should be an assumption of personal and individual liberty? Or do we think that they are credulous fools and therefore it is the job of the state to change their beliefs or redirect them when they stray from the government's true path? 15 centuries before John Stuart Mill was writing in late antiquity, religious philosophers opposed to the growing culture of persecution were developing exactly these arguments. They said that faith, personal opinion, was a matter of belief held by an individual, not of worldly law. Only God could look into the human mind. History has left us with a series of orations by a pagan court official, Themistius, to a Roman Christian emperor in 364 AD, which I think is remarkably modern and still resonate today. Themistius begged the emperor, "No individual has exactly the same beliefs as his neighbour, but one man believes this and another man believes that. Why, therefore, do we use force against them when we know it is ineffectual? It is, in his memorable words, impossible to be pious and God-loving merely out of fear of human law." This, incidentally, was the exact same argument Australia made at the United Nations when we were rightly opposing parts of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in the 1960s. The issue at the time was a prohibition on incitement to discrimination, the very prohibition that ended up part of the Racial Discrimination Act that Andrew Bolt was found to have breached. When we opposed this in the 1960s, we rightly said people cannot be legislated into morality. Unfortunately, we lost that argument on the floor of the United Nations, and international law has invented a grand new human right, the right not to be offended. In retrospect, this argument, this debate, marked the moment when free speech went backwards. Until then, free speech had been winning. Obscenity laws around the world were being shed, blasphemy was no longer a crime, sedition was an obscure and unused statute, not an imminent threat to those who disagreed with the government. But in the last few decades, we've seen a massive resurgence of anti-speech legislation. Not just in the discrimination law that we've talked about already, but political speech is being controlled in the name of campaign finance reform. Commercial speech is being controlled in the name of the nanny state. And governments, as Simon has said, are even threatening to control the press. It's gotten so bad in the United Kingdom, the bedrock nation of individual liberty. In the United Kingdom, people have gone to jail for being rude to celebrities on the internet. This is not an exaggeration. This is happening right now. But I think we might be at a new juncture. We might be at a moment in history where freedom of speech battles can be won again. In recent years, the enemies of freedom of speech have massively overreached. At the IPA, as Simon's mentioned, we've been very pleased by the promise that the new Abbott government intends to repeal parts of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. But in my view, we need more than legislative change. We need a cultural change. We need politicians to understand that Australians are worried about their liberty and that they are very angry when it is taken away from them. In my book, I quote a great French liberal and opponent of Napoleon, Benjamin Constant. He wrote, "One habitual ruse of the enemies of freedom and enlightenment is to affirm that their ignoble doctrine is universally adopted, that principles on which rests the dignity of the human race have been abandoned by unanimous consent already, and that it is somewhat unfashionable and in bad taste to profess them." You will read in the mainstream media today that freedom of speech is not absolute, that it can go too far, that some opinions do not deserve to be aired, and that society has the right to suppress the free expression of its members. But as Benjamin Constant says, it is our job to prove that that is a lie.